Hello and welcome back to the workshop for the first in 2 episodes where I want to present to you the French 1935S pistol and the 1935A pistol. Now the aim of this series is to somewhat re-establish the reputation of the S and perhaps knock down the reputation of the 35A down a notch, because frankly it's not because you've got an obnoxiously good Swiss offspring that you're necessarily the best. The 1935A pistol proposed by SACM, Société Alsacienne de Construction Mécanique, and the 1935S proposed by the Saint-Étienne Arsenal are the two top pistols that emerge from the very lengthy pistol trials that ended in 1936 to determine the new French service pistol. Now, it's widely recorded in common gun books that the 1935A was far superior to the S. Now, I haven't been able to dig in the pistol trials and the archives in minutes to actually see the reasons why. I firmly believe that the difference wasn't that great. Anyway, there was an apparent superiority of one over the other, or perhaps inferiority of one compared to the other. But it was clear from the outset that SACM would be incapable of producing the number required for the French armed forces, still a major colonial power with massive amounts of men. So this was clear from the outset, so it was also clear that they would need another pistol, so they chose the next in line in the competition, which was the S. So concerning the history of the 1935A, we're going to leave that to the second episode, and concerning the production, pretty uneventful to be honest. They started as soon as the adoption was confirmed, and by 1939 they'd already produced 10,000. So it is by far the most common indigenous French pistol of World War II. Concerning the 1935S, that is a whole different story. So as I said, the production of the 1935A kicks off just fine once they're given the green light, but we have to wait pretty much 3 years before production even starts on the 1935S. And the reason for this is that Saint-Étienne had a very peculiar production model in mind. In fact, they had no intention of producing this themselves, or entirely themselves. They wanted to go through private contractors for the production. I don't know whether this was known to the testing commission when the pistol was adopted, but that's what they intended to do. So they couldn't start production straight away. And so this leaves 3 years of to and fro wrangling, fighting over price per unit and who's doing what when. They even refused the aid of the Toul arsenal, which was absolutely prepared and had the capacity to get going given the tooling. But no, Saint-Étienne wanted to micromanage everything, with the consequence that absolutely nothing was done. So Saint-Étienne is lumped with the production after all, and of course it takes time to establish a production line you had no intention of doing to start with. So you need to establish source your tooling, produce any tooling domestically or import, machining schedules, all the gauges and all sorts. And the consequence of this is by the 3rd of May 1939, so when the war were declared, none of these had been produced. And we have to wait 6 months for the first batch of 50 to roll out. And by the time of the armistice, 1,404 had been produced. Come the liberation, it is absolutely clear that the 7.65 long cartridge is on its way out and the future lies with 9mm para. But before the new generation of firearms appear, the armed forces still need pistols, so production of the 35S is once again resumed. Unfortunately, mass is not in a position to continue itself, so it is once again, production is once again, and for good, decentralized, which is what they'd intended to do from the beginning. And the first firm to restart production is still in Saint-Étienne, Manufacture Française d'Armes et de Cycles, and in the course of 1945 they produce a further 10,000 pistols. At the end of that contract it is taken over by the Châtellerault Arsenal, They are the main producers, and a little bit of the production is also handled by the Société d'Application Générale Électrique et Mécanique, SAGEM. So they got their tooling from Mack, and Mack got it from Saint-Étienne. And so Mack itself produces just over 56,000 pistols over 15 years, and the SAGEM does a batch of 10,000 over the course of 6 years. Now, in terms of variants, this pistol actually remains remarkably homogeneous. There's only one modification which leads to one identifiable variant. The safety was redesigned by the Châtellerault Arsenal. I don't know why, because frankly it was fine to start with and they made it worse. So initially it was a recessed safety which is in the slide, very, very similar to Walther's, just that the positions are inversed, so it is in a safe position when it is horizontal. For some reason this was unsuitable, and Mack decided to put it, as you see on this model here, right at the back of the slide, exposed, and you have to flick it up to engage the safety. Don't know why, but of course this modification meant that the machining of the slide needed to be modified, and pistols that are fitted with the slide with this safety are then known as the 1935 SMI, which you can just about make out on this one. Alright, let's have a closer look at this pistol. Now and again I'm also going to use the Mach 50 as a reference, because essentially they are identical, except that the Mach 50 is a little meatier since it's for 9mm para and the locking system is reinforced, but otherwise they are not that different even in dimensions. Just the S is of course slightly slimmer. But yeah, some of the components on this are slightly bigger, so easier for you to see. So what we have is a semi-automatic pistol with a locked breech and using the Browning short recoil system. Let's see it there. Now disassembly is very, very easy. Just push the slide back and kick out locking pin, and there we have it, classic Browning disassembly. We have a captive recoil spring on its guide rod, very similar to the Ruby, not the only similarity with the Ruby that this thing has. And here we have the barrel, which is very, very simple. We have a single pivot here, so really classic Browning, and locking system is with one lug. The 7.65 long is somewhat weaker than 9mm para, so this was sufficient. However, I will say one thing which most gun rags and internet articles have wrong, and that is this locking lug locks up against an internal shoulder, which you can see there. It's often said, rather lazily, that it locks up on the ejection window. Like modern pistols, it does not, because the ejection window here, as is on most pistols of the time, not going across the entire slide, like for a Glock, for example. No, we just have a little side ejection window, and if it only locked up in the ejection window, it would only be locking on this side surface here, but it's locking across the entire shoulder inside, just forward of the ejection window. The lockwork is a removable unit. This is no surprise since it was an explicit requirement of the trials, and once again this is extremely close to the Ruby lockwork, except it's in a separate housing. The only major difference is that the spring for the sear is internal, is around the pivot point. It's got a little coil spring at the back that pushes against the housing in the Ruby. The other major difference is that this is now a rebounding hammer. So in its at rest position, it is removed from the firing pin. It's easier on this one. So there's the firing pin and it's at rest away from it. It can't come into contact with it unless you have the trigger pulled. but then it comes back to its resting position away from it. So that was one safety of the system, and the other one, as we've discussed before, is safety on the slide, and that is a simple firing pin block. So yeah, that is basically the only difference between the lockwork of a 35S and Mach 50 and a Ruby. The magazine has a capacity of 8 rounds, single stack, and notice this little nub that sticks out on the left side. Now this is one of the reasons why a S magazine is not compatible with an A pistol frame, because the S has a little cutout for the passage of this notch. Now the purpose of this is twofold. Firstly, it is part of the magazine safety, because that's what all the cool kids were doing at the time, and the other one is mentioned nowhere, and I refuse to believe that it is just a coincidence, but we'll get back to that in a second. The way the magazine safety works is that without the magazine, the transfer bar here between the trigger and the sear is being pushed down by this disconnector assembly. It looks a bit like a pair of dividers. And this means that the transfer bar is not in contact with the sear, and you can pull the trigger all you like, nothing's going to happen. So what happens when you put in the magazine? You can see the little nub there. It's going to push up against the lower arm of the disconnector, which allows the transfer bar to lift. It's got its own little torsion spring, so it flips up. It is now in contact with the sear, and it operates as it should. Now, the other unintended consequence of this is that when you insert the mag, the nub is pushing up against the lower arm, as I said, but it is also happening to charge this little coil spring between the two legs here of the disconnector. Now, this is not really necessary, because this disconnector here is being pushed up and down, or can be pushed up and down, by the spring of the transfer bar, like the Ruby. Another coincidence. So in the Ruby, it's just a floating transfer bar here, floating disconnector, sorry, and it's biased upwards simply by the power of the spring on the transfer bar. Yes, you could say this is to make sure that to reinforce the effectiveness, the functionality of the disconnectors, but one thing this does provide, and again not written anywhere, is that the magazine ejection is very, very strong, because this little arm is pushing down on it. And I can't believe this is just an unintended consequence, but I can't find any proof that they designed it so. This is exactly the same on the Mach 50. It's got the same construction. It literally gets thrown out into your hand. It's pretty common to have the mag geometry set up such that when it's empty, the plate here comes into contact with the bottom of the breech block in the slide, and there's a little bit enough spring tension in there that the magazine gets a little start when you eject it, like in the A here. So you just get a little bit, so it's easier to grab and eject. But that is something quite different to what's happening here, where it literally jumps out. So this would be another interesting thing to see if indeed it was something that is explicitly designed, or just a happy coincidence due to this this desire to have a very, very efficient and always functioning disconnector. And lastly, a quick look at the sights. Perfectly standard for a combat pistol, fixed of course. The front is a ramp, slightly textured to help to try and reduce glare, and we've got a short notch but quite wide and nicely U-shaped, which results in something you can pick up pretty easily, and so good for combat situations. So what I guess I'm trying to say is the 35S is in fact a perfectly good compact combat pistol, and I think in that role, close quarters, defense, combat pistol, it is actually superior to the 35A. There, I've said it, can't take it back. It has got a better combat trigger. There's no creep in it whatsoever. The sight's big, blocky, nice and open, and it's got, of course, that handy rapid ejection for rapid reloads. Now, concerning accuracy, up to 25 meters, perfectly fine, which is frankly the range this is most likely to be used at, if not shorter. For those of you who didn't watch my French-only participation video into the French GunTubers shooting challenge, I shot a 10-shot string with this, and I'll put the footage at the end of the video so you can watch it or not. But you'll see there that the accuracy is perfectly fine. And of course with my hand loads, because here we cannot walk into a shop and say, give me your box of your finest 7.65 long, sir. So, speaking of reloads, I have two observations, which may be down to my pistol, since I have a sample of one. So maybe any of you who also have one of these, or even better, have the S and the A, and then can compare the two. I've noticed that, firstly, this requires softer primers. I think that's simply to do with the fact that it's got a rebounding hammer, and that the firing pin is extremely light. So, there's a fraction of a second contact as the hammer hits the firing pin. The firing pin has very, very little inertia. So, consequence of that, I have to use federal primers to get consistent ignition. And the other thing is that this seems to prefer rather hotter loads than the 35A. So the A has got something going for it, I assure you. When I was doing the load development with sort of incremental steps of powder, basically the A functioned with anything. The precision would vary, and there's a sweet spot concerning grouping, but it feeds fine. Whereas this one, beneath a certain threshold, it just will not cycle. We saw that in the vid with Buddy when the mic was going through the sort of interwar pistols. Buddy tried to fire it, it didn't cycle, and the loaded chamber indicator was pointing skywards. I upped the load after that, and now it works fine. If you watch the video, you'll see. So, we're at the end of part one of this series. I hope it was vaguely entertaining, and I hope I've somewhat restored the reputation of the 1935S. And leaves me just to say thank you, of course, for all your support, whatever platform you wish to follow us on, and see you very soon, either back here in the workshop or out on the range. Bye!